But so before this call got started and before everyone got on, I was talking to Peter about the last years of Walt Whitman's life. So I'm talking not about not the young Whitman that you can maybe see from the frontispiece of the first edition of Leaves of Grass, and not even the middle-aged Whitman, the Civil War nurse, the resident in Washington D.C., but like the Whitman in later years who lived in Camden, New Jersey. So in the last years of his life, Walt Whitman basically spent every day talking to his friend and secretary and later literary executor Horace Traubel, just having conversations every day. And Horace Traubel, very luckily for us, literally recorded stenographically every single one of these conversations. So there's a lot. And in the conversations, more than once, Walt Whitman refers to what he calls his great secret. And Horace Traubel even writes it with a capital G and a capital S, his great secret. And Horace is always trying to work out of Walt Whitman what this secret is. Like, he'll say, I don't suppose you could tell me today, Walt, what the secret is. And Walt will sort of toy with him, saying something along the lines of, oh, I think it's about time that I did. I owe you that much at least, and saying, but today isn't the day. And so he keeps putting it off, and he never reveals whatever the secret is. There are plenty of scholars who think that the great secret, capital G, capital S, could be something like Whitman's sexuality, for example, which even to Horace Traubel was really no secret. Or perhaps Whitman suggested this at least once, the idea that Whitman had children somewhere. Although this is totally unverified. Nobody really seriously thinks Whitman had any children that we're aware of. But sometimes what I like to think about when I think about the Great Secret is the possibility that Whitman is referring to texts, so to things that he did and he made that he put out into the world that no one was aware of. Um, I don't know that we'll ever know, but I'm going to share with you today some of the great secrets that Walt Whitman took to his grave, but that now we are learning of, thanks to um, research done by scholars the world over. By the way, I'm going to show you now, if you can still see my screen, I'm going to show you one of my favorite pictures of Walt Whitman. So the three I've lined up here are very, very representative of the man as he wanted to be remembered. This picture is less often reproduced, but I love it. So you can see here, this is Whitman living in his Camden house that I mentioned in the last years of his life. And as you can see, he was not exactly a neat freak. Like, if you look close, so these are Whitman's personal papers, his notebooks, his journals, his just scrap paper with poetry written on it, letters. You can even see they're stacked up in the upper left-hand corner. They're stacked up and sort of teetering over next to him. Whitman essentially, we would have not used the term at the time, but he could be described today as something like a hoarder, or to be more generous, a pack rat, right? This was how he was comfortable living. Whitman, fortunately for all of us, held on to paper. This is a very important thing to know about Walt Whitman, the person, is that not only was he a poet and an artist and a writer and a journalist and an editor and a Long Island boy, he was a keeper of paper. There are other authors for whom this is not true at all. So to give you a counterexample, Herman Melville um, was glad to burn manuscripts. In some of the most famous letters he ever received from Nathaniel Hawthorne, these soaring letters, Melville read them and internalized them and then threw them on the fire and ate lunch. Whitman, on the other hand, as you can see here, was a keeper of his papers. And so among these papers are all sorts of loose ends that lead off to who knows where. So at Whitman's death, his friend and literary executor Horace, as well as two other literary executors, they literally shoveled up these papers and stuffed them into barrels, and they split them three ways. Whitman had three literary executors. Each of them collected roughly a third of these papers, like in empty wine barrels, and they took them off and began doing the diligent work of transcribing them and collecting them and ordering them. And over time, that scholarly work has yielded quite a few formerly unknown texts. So let me give you a sense of the rediscovery history of Whitman, because rediscovering his items is nothing new. As Peter pointed out before, Whitman is known, among other things, for Brooklyniana. It's a local color travel series. It was rediscovered by the one and only Emery Holloway in 1916. Essentially a book length travel series about Brooklyn and Long Island. And there are many more. New York Dissected is another similar travel series. Letters from a Traveling Bachelor is another. There are letters and short stories and poems that have been rediscovered after Whitman's death. And if the font is not too small, you can see from those dates that rediscovering Whitman has been a fairly regular activity. It just keeps happening. And in part, that's because we have so much of Whitman's ephemera, all of his notebooks and jottings. But that's also in part because Whitman published and wrote so much. This is one of the most prolific poets in American history. And in addition to being, the new poet that Emerson had predicted, Whitman was also a hard-bitten, longtime journalist. I mean, Walt Whitman, he founded newspapers of his own. If you've read The Long Islander, which is a still active newspaper published, I think it's still out of Huntington, that was founded by Walt Whitman in 18. Well, he was 19 years of age and he delivered it on horseback. Um, because Walt Whitman wrote so much, and because he lived not in penury, but Whitman lived close to the bone for a great many years. He had to make ends meet, and in part this was by writing journalism and prose outside of the bounds of poetry. The things that I'm going to talk to you about today, they sort of bridge the gap between manuscripts and physical things and the digital world. So let me give you an example. The 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 reason I'm here today, and I think the reason I have an academic job, probably, I'm a professor at the University of Idaho, is because in 2015, I was a doctoral candidate at the University of Houston, just studying and in my free time, which is a thing I no longer have, um, exploring the literature on Walt Whitman. And so one day I came across this little note, and you can see it here. Right? It's called Walt Whitman Pseudonyms. It was written in the 1950s by a great Whitman scholar named William White, um, whose footsteps I always feel like I'm walking in. And here William White says, in addition to using Walter Whitman, Walt Whitman, and W.W. to sign his stories and his poems and articles, the author of Leaves of Grass also used, especially early in his career, the pseudonyms a schoolmaster, Pominock, a traveler, a pedestrian, you know who, Mose Velser, George Selwyn, and J.R.S. And White goes on to inquire whether some other pseudonyms might have been Whitman's. So when I was looking at these as a doctoral candidate, they had this sort of special aura about them. Not to age myself, but having grown up using things like Google and other internet search engines regularly, seeing these names and phrases in quotation marks made me think of search engine keywords. Depending on the extent to which you use the internet, you may use something like Google every week or even every day. Because we live in a digital era, we begin to think in things like keywords. And to me, these look like very valuable keywords because some of them are so unusual. Pominock, for example, the native name for Long Island, is not a common word. It's certainly not one that you'll find commonly in 19th century periodicals, which is what I was studying at the time. The same is true of Mose Velser. That is not a name that you trip over every day. And so it occurred to me that maybe these names might be useful as search terms in digital archives. Maybe I would use them to dig around and turn up who knows what. Um, so I took these things and I used them in fairly widely available academic databases. You can see one here. It's called ProQuest. This is a database of historic periodicals and newspapers. So 19th century New York newspapers are collected here, for example, and they're searchable. As you may be able to see on your screen, when I searched the name Mose Velser, what was yielded were only four results. So over more than a century of periodicals, four results is not very many. That means this is a very uncommon phrase. And when I did the searching, and keep in mind I'm a clueless doctoral candidate at the time, what came up for me was a literary notice, and you can see it here. I can read some of it for you. It says the New York Atlas, this old established weekly, will contain several attractive features tomorrow. And this is a literary notice from 1858. And you know, there's you can see it advertises Maria Monckton, the Fair Spy, A Romance of New York. Um, the Great Revolutionary Story, and then it says at the bottom, original articles on manly training by Mose Velser. And then it, in the style of, I guess, almost like a monster truck rally, it says, in the Atlas, tomorrow, tomorrow, tomorrow. Um, at the time, I had been studying Whitman, and I had never heard of articles on manly training by Whitman. And you know, because this is by Mose Velser, which is a fairly well-known pen name of Whitman's, I thought, well, this is probably him, but what is this manly training business? That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Um, so as a doctoral candidate, I did what I think anyone would do. I tried to find these pieces. At the time, it meant sending away for microfilm. And fun fact, this was my first encounter with microfilm, which is now one of the great loves of my life. I love microfilm and microfiche. It's just the oh, I'll happily talk about it more in the question and answers if you want. But I sent away for some microfilm that would contain what this article might be. And I just sort of went on about my life. I forgot about this. I had a new baby at the time. My wife and I were pursuing our PhDs. And then one day the library called me and said, "You have your microfilm has come." So I walked over to the library. And by the way, getting microfilm from another library is something that anyone can do. I mean, whether you're at the Brentwood Library or University Library, using interlibrary loan to get rare microfilm is a very simple way to get your hands on something that you would never otherwise see. So I was given this microfilm. I fed it into the microfilm reader and scrolled to the appropriate day. And what I saw in front of me after about a month of waiting was this. It's not terribly easy to see because I had to take a whole screenshot here. But over on the right, it says manly health and training with offhand hints toward their achievement by Mose Velser. And it says original for the New York Atlas. This thing that I was looking at, published in 1858, was an article on urban men's wellness by Walt Whitman, or at least it seemed to be. And so I read it. It's several columns in this newspaper, and at the end it says to be continued in next issue. And I thought, well, that's fascinating. I thought I was going to find a single article. You know, to be continued is great. I love to be continued. Let's continue. Um, Scrolling to the next issue, there's another installment by Mose Velser of Brooklyn, it says. And at the end of that installment, it says to be continued. So I scroll to the next, to be continued. And as I'm scrolling through these articles and reading them, I increasingly am realizing I'm reading a major lost text by Walt Whitman. I, in this basement of my university library, am the only person alive who has set eyes on this thing. This is a lost book by Walt Whitman. Yeah, I'm leaving out the expletives that came out of my mouth, but I was very excited. This is a very exciting moment. Um, what was particularly exciting is that this is a verifiable piece of Whitman's work. In the same university library, there is a bound set of Whitman's notebooks and unpublished prose manuscripts. So very diligent Whitman scholars transcribed all of his notebooks and manuscripts and collected them. And what I found by flipping through them, because they are collected by topic, is that at the very end of the last volume, so volume 6 in the very back, are transcribed a few of Walt Whitman's notes on body and physique, including a draft advertisement for a series on manly training that is not known to have come to be. And so I looked at this draft advertisement, and then I looked at the advertisement published in the New York Atlas, and they are one and the same. So this proved right then and there that not only might this be Walt Whitman's work, this was Walt Whitman's work. Like the one and only, written while he was writing the third edition of Leaves of Grass. He had also written a full book-length treatise on urban men's wellness and health. And I can assure you that this treatise, which has now been published in hardback, is a fascinating look at mid 19th century um, notions of health and populist wellness reform. Walt Whitman in this text talks about everything from whether or not to shave. He recommends not shaving to keep the face and neck warm, to playing baseball, to wearing soft canvas shoes instead of leather shoes. Soft canvas shoes of the sort worn by baseball players. Today we would call them sneakers or tennis shoes. Um, to avoiding prostitutes, to eating a diet that's largely meat and bread. It just everything you can think of is in this treatise, written by the one and only Walt Whitman and forgotten for more than a century. I can assure you that experiencing that moment, seeing something that no one else has seen who is now alive, being the only living person to know about a lost book by someone as great as Walt Whitman, is an addictive sensation. You do want to feel that again. I think it certainly sealed my academic life because I've since dedicated it to looking for more lost publications by authors like Whitman. Um, Fortunately for me, Whitman didn't end with manly health and training. In fact, the very next year of my graduate program, having spent more time among his notebooks and his odds and ends, his manuscripts, I found something else that was, if anything, perhaps even more startling. So this is called Life and Adventures of Jack Angle. And here again is it's sort of the same story, but a different day. So having found manly health and training, I thought, good God, there must be more loose ends of this sort that lead off who knows where. Um, and one loose end that was particularly promising was a notebook that Whitman kept that was full of ideas toward what appeared to be fictions. They're fictions about pickpockets and murderers and schoolmasters who marry women to inveigle them out of their fortunes. Very sort of pulpy stuff. Fiction of the sort that Whitman had written early in his career. But the bulk of this one notebook contains ideas toward what seems to be a fairly long fiction. And it's the font is not particularly large, but I can tell you that right here, what I'm showing you, is a transcript of two of the pages. It says that the main hinge of the story will be the villain, Mr. Covert, which is a very subtle name for a villain. Mr. Covert's determination to embezzle Martha's property. This is his adoptive daughter, by means of withholding deeds, wills, and documents, etc. And Jack Angle, the hero, who early discovers that intention, being pervaded by a determination to foil him. This was not, again, at the time known to have come to anything. You know, there's no fiction, according to bibliographies of Whitman's work, that is essentially a Dickensian tale of love and theft and murder. Certainly none with the character named Jack Angle as the hero. However, as with manly health and training, Jack Angle seemed like, and so did the other names in this notebook, they seemed like particularly good names to use to search through digital archives. And indeed, using those names, I was able to find a literary notice that promises, this is again, this is the New York Times. This literary notice appeared March 12th, 1852. 1852, by the way, is the first year that the New York Daily Times was in operation. And this notice promises a rich revelation. It says, this week's Sunday Dispatch will contain the life and adventures of Jack Angle, an autobiography in which will be handled the philosophy and philanthropy and pauperism, law, crime, love, etc. It's a very overblown, puffy advertisement. Um, and it says, you'll find familiar cases and characters with explanations necessary to properly understand what it's all about. Now, this is different than Manly Health and Training. This does not list a name. You can see there's no Mose Velser, there's no Jack Engel, there's no Walt Whitman, there's no name attached to this. And yet, I can tell you that when I first saw this newspaper advertisement, it was after midnight. My wife was asleep. Our new baby was asleep. I was awake reading this. I was sort of thrumming with energy seeing this advertisement because something about it felt Whitmanian to me, and I can't put my finger on what exactly. Um, when you have internalized enough of an artist's work, I think it's been said that some people who are familiar enough can sort of sense their presence without knowing why. I think in this case, the overblown nature of the advertisement is very Whitmanian. He often advertised his fictions this way, and also the comment that it will be need to be read in order to be properly understood. That's a very Whitmanian way of advertising a fiction. And then, of course, the name Jack Engel, which is surprisingly uncommon in newspapers of the period. So, as with Manly Health and Training, I had to send away for microfilm. And indeed, there was a big roadblock in my way, which is that this is not available on microfilm. There are no issues of the New York Sunday Dispatch that you can get on microfilm anywhere in the world. It's not possible. However, there's one institution that does keep physical copies of these issues, and that blessed institution is the Library of Congress. So I sent an email to the Library of Congress, oh so subtly requesting to see images from this issue of the newspaper that's advertised. And when it finally came, what I saw again in front of me was something that no one living had seen. And you can see it here. It says, "A Story of New York at the Present Time, Life and Adventures of Jack Engel, an Autobiography." This fiction, which is not signed, contains all the character names from Whitman's notebook. Even the most eccentric. Wigglesworth is a name. Martha the Quakeress, Jack Engel, um, Pepperidge Ferris. Every single one of these names appears in the story. And the story follows the plot notes written in Whitman's notebook. So we can verify now that this is indeed a novel that Whitman wrote in 1852. And if you think about it, 1852 is quite a year. This is a time when Whitman is building houses in Brooklyn with his father, developing real estate properties, and writing the poetry that will become Leaves of Grass. So we now know that Whitman, while he was becoming that poet, sort of changing his public persona from journalist to poet, he was also dabbling in fiction. And it's entirely possible. We know from his notebooks that he was in search of a genre that was capacious enough to handle his thoughts. He very easily could have ended up being a novelist or an orator, these different sort of professions had laid out before him, if only they had sold well. As far as we know, this novel eventually sank without a trace. But one of the values of being able to find lost works like this is that you realize that, confident though he presented himself, Whitman did not become that poet that you see here with the cocky poet with his hand on his hip until Leaves of Grass came to be. And in the meantime, he was publishing in all sorts of different ways. Um, Something else to note too, and I would strongly encourage any of you to read this novel. It's available in paperback. Is to keep in mind Whitman's own words, which are, "Not a mark and not a record remains, and yet all remains." This comes from a later poem of his called Unnamed Lands. I like to think sometimes that Walt Whitman urges us to keep looking for him. And there's a very famous quote from Song of Myself that I'll quote later that suggests that much. Knowing what we do about Whitman, that he published so much secretly and apparently never told anyone about. There are no records in his letters or his conversations about any of this. It's entirely possible that there's more out there. I'll give you a couple of examples. Oh, and by the way, here's Manly Health and Training, and here's Life and Adventures of Jack Angle. They are now books. Walt Whitman had books, new books coming out in 2016 and 2017, written about in the New York Times. I can't imagine many other American authors who died in the 19th century who have new books out. And there may be more to find. So, to give you a couple of examples, one is called The Sleep Talker. In 1850, Walt Whitman writes a letter to the proprietors of the New York Sun, offering a manuscript called The Sleep Talker. He says it's the most interesting and romantic and full of incident of any story I've come across. This is a novel that Whitman seems to have written in full, adapted from a Danish novel called The Childhood of King Eric Menved. It's a horribly boring Danish novel. And Whitman, he says in his letter, he's condensed it, taken out most of the Danish history, and made it about a young American man who falls in love with a woman and has a condition referred to in the title, sleep talking. And it's full of incident and dialogue and things, all things stirring. He offers it to the proprietors of the New York Sun, and he even estimates how many columns of the newspaper it would take up. He says here, the story would make about 65 leaded short columns of the Sun, so that an average of 3 columns a day would run through 22 days. You can see from this letter that Whitman wrote a complete manuscript which he is offering to this newspaper to publish serially. As far as we know, this goes nowhere. The New York Sun rejects him. He offers it to another paper called The New Yorker, no relation to the current magazine, and then it disappears. It's entirely possible that the Whitman that we know and love, the poet of America, may have secretly published yet another novel in some archived New York newspaper. And this isn't even the only one. There are other plot notes that Walt Whitman wrote in 1858 or 59 toward a novel that he tentatively titles "Proud Antoinette: A New York Romance of Today." These are a little too small to read, but I can tell you that these manuscripts are plot notes toward a pot-boiling mystery novel about a Quakeress turned prostitute named Antoinette, who in the notes that you see here would marry a man in order to inveigle him out of his fortune, and then she murders someone, and then there's a trial. It's the spirit. It's a very, again, Whitman's fiction tends toward the Dickensian. These notes are as extensive as the ones for the novel that I found, and yet no one knows that this ever became a book. Um, but there are tantalizing clues that it did. And I can show you one more. So at the bottom of this manuscript page, you can see there's a little torn off section. And here, I'll make it bigger for you. So that you can't really make out what Whitman is writing here, but he says, this is, it is a, and then some word that begins with N, good F, like good for, and then there's a few more, but, and then at the end, SU with an underline. It's not clear what he's trying to say here, but Whitman editors have assumed that these are trial poetry lines, that Whitman was writing poetry and just sort of tore this portion of the manuscript off. But I've looked, and these don't correspond to any poetry Whitman ever wrote or published. So it is possible that these are notes about this being a novel. It is a novel, good for, it almost looks like he's writing publication instructions. And the word at the end, SU, underlined, think about, because it's underlined, it could be the title of something. Think about how many newspapers start with SU, whether it's the New York Sun or the Sunday Times or the Sunday Dispatch or the Sunday Mercury. There are all sorts of possibilities for where this potentially lost novel may be. Whitman, we are all very fortunate that the Whitman we know and love left so many traces of his work. And those traces are everywhere, and you can see them coming up. It's not just his bylines and his pen names, of which there are many, as you can see, but there are even more. For example, in physical archives, there are all sorts of Whitman manuscripts that continue to come to light, often via auctions. I'll give you an example. In 1848, Whitman founded a newspaper called the Brooklyn Daily Freeman, and he edited and published it for a year. The newspaper office of the Freeman burned down, and every issue was lost except the very first issue of the Freeman, until just 2 years ago, another issue of the Brooklyn Daily Freeman came up at auction in New York. And very disappointingly, no Whitmanians knew about it until it had already sold for the heartbreaking sum of $200. So there's a there's we can, I think, expect more of Whitman to come out because there are so many traces of Whitman everywhere. There are newspaper reprints of his early writings in the Long Islander, that newspaper he founded at the age of 19. There are transcribed lectures of his that appear in other newspapers of the day. There are magazines that are now digitized and searchable online. You can read old copies of Lippincott's and Atlantic Monthly online for free. There's microfilm, of course, and there are near infinite digital repositories out there that may contain the works of Walt Whitman. And we have Walt Whitman goading us on. Um, I'm just going to sort of speed ahead in the interest of getting to your questions, but Whitman isn't one man. He is, as he said, he contains multitudes. And the things that I study are a part of that great unread that we all get to explore in the 21st century. If this is American literature, that hard nucleus of canonized works, the vast galaxy of unknown writings, many of them in archives or old newspapers, are that great unread that we can all explore today. And Whitman encourages us. He ends Song of Myself with the great words, failing to fetch me at first, keep encouraged. Missing me one place, search another. I stop somewhere waiting for you. I like to think he's challenging us to keep searching for him. And that's what I'm going to do. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. And here I'll stop sharing my screen. There you go.
Very interesting. Does anybody have any questions before I start asking my questions?
It was great.
It was great. I'll tell you that. That was wonderful.
I'm sorry, I had a bolt in and out, but it was wonderful. Are you in Ohio now?
Oh, I'm in Idaho now. Yes. So I work at the University of Idaho. I'm a professor of American literature. And when I'm not teaching or on committees or on delightful go meeting calls with people in Long Island, I do this kind of work regularly. So this is the research that I do, and not just for Walt Whitman. There are a lot of other authors for whom this is possible.
Well, thank you for being part of the Brentwood Library family. This was very special.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I'm really honored to speak to you all.
it was really good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, Peter, I always have a question.
Okay. What's your
And
question?
I'll do. So, hi, first of all, thank you again for being part of us today. But you mentioned that the name Velsor was kind of an unusual name. However, there was a woman on Long Island who lived in Islip, and her name was Mary Velsor. And there is I believe, now my memory, I wasn't prepared for this, so I don't have all my facts in my compartmentalized brain, but I believe that she died, I want to say maybe like in the early like the first decade, but she was one of the founding members of the Presbyterian Church in Islip, which is where I attend. But there's a connection to her, I believe, to Walt Whitman.
Interesting.
And Walt Whitman had a cousin who owned a home in Islip, and I believe that was her father. I
Really?
believe. I now, it's a long time ago since I did this, but Peter, you have the notes on that. You copied them.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
Her name
I'm
is Vel.
Velser, Mary Velser. I can,
Oh,
I can look it up and get back to you, Peter. But and there was actually a house in Islip, and I think it was opposite where H2O is, the old beech tree. And I
Mhm.
think that was a house that the father had lived in, Velsor. And I also think that he built a house like where Racine's is. That was one of the houses. I know with this stuff, you're not a Long Islander, so you don't know, but there's a lot of, there's a lot of stuff that's local. But there was somebody, Mary Velser, and I believe she's buried in Oakwood Cemetery.
Okay, that's really interesting. Yeah, it sounds likely that there is a relation. One of the reasons that Whitman chose the name Velser in that pen name is that his mother's maiden name was Louisa Van Velser. Um, and
Uh,
then I believe Mose, because it's Mose Velser. Mose was a common Bowery boy name, sort of like the name of like a tough who would have lived in, like what would now be the Bowery, the meatpacking district. But he would often when I said at the beginning that Whitman held on to paper, he also held on to words that meant a lot to him. So, for example, Paumanok, right, the native name for Long Island, sort of becomes one of these names that is just inextricably associated with Whitman, and because it has meaning to him, right? It's geographic, it's cultural, and Velser is another. I think he constructed two pen names out of it. There's Mose Velser and also Velser Brush, because his mother's maiden name was Brush.
Gosh.
I would be very interested to learn more, though. That's a fascinating fact.
Yeah, Mary Velser. That name is in my mind for some reason. I'll have to look up the stuff too.
Oh, that'd be great.
Yeah, yeah.
Coming. All right. Well,
Where did you where did you grow up? Did you grow up in Idaho?
I didn't. So Idaho, I had never thought that I would end in Idaho, and yet here I am. I'm a Texan by birth. I grew up in Austin, Texas, and then after I graduated high school, I went to NYU for my undergrad, and sort of spent some time in Whitman's Manhattan, and then I went elsewhere for my graduate degrees. But I'm a little ashamed to say that as an undergrad, I had very little education about Walt Whitman. I hadn't read Song of Myself or Leaves of Grass. I didn't take the opportunity to visit Huntington or any of the the places that are associated with Whitman today. Um, uh, it was only later in my life that I really read and got into Walt Whitman because of a graduate class and a professor who brought Whitman to me, and suddenly had this awakening where I thought, like, where have you been all my life? This is such overawing, masterful, like moving poetry. Um, and I think that was what got me on this path. But no, I'm a Texan by birth, and
I didn't,
Idaho was not on my radar until
You
through
never
career.
had music grass?
no,
I had that upstairs for,
yeah,
Yeah. Does anyone else have any questions?
one of the thoughts I'd had about Walt Whitman is that, like you were saying, sometimes he's not very interesting when we're younger in school. But I feel like part of the appeal of Leaves of Grass is actually similar to the appeal of self-help books, which he also. Do you feel like that at all? Like Leaves of Grass, Song of Myself is very like inspirational.
I know what you mean. It's weird to say that Leaves of Grass is like resonates in the same rainbow as self-help culture, but it is true. Whitman was a very big fan in the 1840s and 50s and 60s because he was a newspaper editor, he had to read and digest all sorts of current events and items. And in his journalism of the period, we see him being strongly attracted to um, what we would now call self-help literature, whether it is health and wellness literature or populist sort of medical treatments, or even phrenology, right? You know, the pseudoscience of the bumps in your skull. Whitman loved that stuff. And I think in part it's because he really cottoned to the idea of being able to improve the self. That Whitman celebrates everything. He embraces the universe. He embraces manure and weeds as much as he does roses and fresh earth. Um, but he also, there's a strong desire in Whitman's work to see America and Americans evolve into something, that encapsulates humanity, that is the best that we can be. And when you read The Leaves of Grass, you can sense that about him. Um, yeah, Whitman had a very strong attraction to self-help narratives and also to the populist medical movements of the day, whether it was phrenology or water cures or exercise regimens, many of which are just like what we would do today. Or even to things that he seems to have made up. So in Manly Health and Training, he recommends, um, apparently with a straight face, that you eat a diet that is mostly composed of rare cooked beef, um, bread, and tea with the occasional potato or cabbage. And he's really strongly averse to vegetables and fruits. I mean, anyone today would now tell you that that's absurd, that you really should eat vegetables and fruits. But at the time, there were many different movements, whether it's vegetarianism or movements by like John Kellogg or Sylvester Graham, that promoted health and taking one's health in one's own hands by doing something as simple as modifying your diet. And Whitman fully buys into those things. He was a man of many interests.
Do you feel that the Walt Whitman character, like the larger than life character that narrates Leaves of Grass and what he was saying in the diet book, also, do you feel like there's a little bit of humor to it, like it's slightly lighthearted?
Maybe so. I was talking about this with a friend just the other day, that something that it takes a while to realize about Leaves of Grass is that there's very little humor in it. Which is not to say that it's a serious or dour book, but Leaves of Grass has these grand ambitions. And I defy any of you to find a joke in Leaves of Grass. Go ahead. Like if you open up Moby Dick, you'll find a joke on the first page. Leaves of Grass takes itself very seriously, and I think for good reason. But it's often overlooked that Whitman had a very good sense of humor, and whether it's in his journalism or in Manly Health and Training, he's often taking himself and his subject less than seriously. But as to whether it's the same Whitman, I don't know. He's one of the paragons of the self-made person, other than say Ben Franklin. I think Whitman is almost the exemplar of the self-made American. Through hard work and presenting himself to the public as a particular persona, he was really able to invent and reinvent himself over and over again. And one of the reasons I think these finds is so interesting is that it can often feel like the Whitman of the 1850s, especially the poet who publishes Leaves of Grass in 1855, just sort of springs out of nowhere. What little we know of him in the 1850s, he's developing houses in Brooklyn, he's writing poetry, and then he becomes this, the rough, the bearded, one of the men on the street. It feels like he just leaps into the world fully formed as that poet, that artist that you can see him in your head. And that's simply not true. That is not remotely true. Whitman, from top to bottom, presented himself as a particular persona, created that persona, and essentially promoted it all by himself. And it's easy to forget that he was putting on and trying on different identities of this sort. Um, and his notebooks of the period confirm this. He thinks to himself in his writings, I could be the next great American orator He even writes up little draft advertisements for orations on America that he would deliver and then publish for a handsome profit, or that he would maybe write a great opera or a great novel. Um, it's really a testament to his genius that he essentially made up a new genre of literature in order to convey these things that are bubbling up inside of him at those times. But it's funny to see that he is also a workaday writer who's just trying to write something that will land. And it's amazing. I find it very humanizing in that way.
Do you think he would have, if either of those books had taken off, would he have been happy to be Walt Whitman the novelist, or the next the first Norman Vincent Peale, or something like that?
First, it's hard to say. I think he would have been happy to be a successful writer in any case. And I think once the moment he could consider himself a successful writer as a poet was right about the time the third edition of Leaves of Grass is published in 1860. That's the first edition that really sells anything, and it sort of makes his name. From there on, he really is writing very little in the way of prose, and then he becomes a Civil War nurse, and it all goes into the poetry, and he becomes that Whitman we now know. But whether he would have been happy to be a novelist, it's hard to say. I can't say that at the end of his life. So in those conversations with his friend and secretary Horace, there is a moment where one day he says to Horace says to him, "There's a collection of your early short stories that's being issued without your permission." And Whitman is aware of it. He had read about it in a newspaper. And I'm paraphrasing, but this is almost a direct quote. He says, "I would almost be tempted to shoot the man if I saw him in the street." So Whitman had a relationship with his fiction that's complicated. He even, at the end of his life, he issues the complete Leaves of Grass, the deathbed edition, plus a complete volume of his prose. And that includes, I think it's 8 of his early short stories. And he includes in a note, he says, he says something like, "These are early boyish works, but I reissue them here to prevent the annoyance of their surreptitious issue." Right? Basically saying, if someone's going to publish these again, at least it'll be me. But he does not include or mention Life and Adventures of Jack Engle. He doesn't mention Manly Health and Training. So I do sometimes wonder what he would think, knowing that these are now rediscovered and out in the world. And a part of me thinks that he'd be really pissed off. If somebody dug up the things that I had tried to hide in my life, I would probably be rather upset. And yet, Whitman he aspired to be that great poet, the pivot of American culture, the one who encapsulates a nation. And he happens to have done it. And he wanted more than anything to be remembered and to affect posterity. And I think he would also in that way be delighted that this is occurring, knowing that he is that valuable and central even today in the United States.
I didn't
I
even
like
know
to
that.
think that anyway.
I didn't know that he had written short stories also.
He did. He in the 1840s he wrote a temperance novel called Franklin Evans. Very quickly, he wrote it in 3 days, according to his own word, and he wrote something like 24 short stories. So he was a fairly accomplished fiction writer, even as a young man. And it is entirely possible that while he was publishing his first and second edition of Leaves of Grass, so before that successful third edition, it's very possible that he published more that we simply don't know about. And I'm going to do my damnedest to try to find it.
I was going to ask if you thought
Good
it would
luck finding them.
Thank you.
It was very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Well, does anyone else have any questions that they'd like to ask? This has been a real pleasure. I really appreciate being invited and being able to speak to all of you.
No,
be.
this
Thank
was
you for
great.
joining us.
This was
Yeah.
really very enjoyable, informative. It changed my opinion of Walt Whitman, made him
Oh,
more interesting to me. And I know Peter's been obsessed with him for a long time, but we had at Stony Brook, where I went to college, one of the dorms was named after Walt Whitman. It was like, yeah, okay, yeah, the Walt Whitman Leaves of Grass, very, very minimal
Mhm.
information about him. But this was, he's really been brought to life. You've brought him
Great.
to life in a much more interesting way.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate that. Also, I noticed somebody asked in the chat how old my baby is now. That's a good question. So he's now an 8-year-old,
Wow.
and his brother is now 4. So they've grown up alongside this work. They're big. It's amazing how quickly they grew up.
Yes, they do.
Are either one of them named Walter?
No, we actually considered naming one of them Walter.
Oh.
One is named John, and his middle name is Mallory, after George Mallory, the mountain climber. And then the other is Henry David, after the one and only Henry David Thoreau. But
Oh,
yeah,
Peter.
we did seriously consider naming one of them Walter. He was a finalist for sure.
There you go. There you go. Peter is an admirer of Thoreau as well. Right, Peter?
Likewise.
Oh yeah, definitely.
It's fun
Yeah.
to meet somebody not from Long Island who loves Walt Whitman. We all are curious about him and we read about him, but we think it's a homeboy, and it's fun to share with somebody out of our territory. That's
Oh yeah,
exciting.
I really one of the reasons I like doing things like this is that I just want to continue to make sure that Walt Whitman's name is out there. Whitman's name in the Northeast is everywhere. His name is on a bridge in Philadelphia. It's on schools. It's on dormitories. It's in tunnels. Particularly in New York and surrounding, Whitman is he's just in everyone's minds. But I think it's important to sort of keep getting Leaves of Grass and getting Walt Whitman back out there because he still has so much to teach us and to show us.